feel that we need to throw someone under the bus to explain the kind of concepts of what we're talking about here. And I feel the person who turned up to the call with Shaw's algorithm behind him is probably the right person to do that. So I don't know, Chris, explain to us what on earth we're talking about here. What's the context?
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. So QDay.
Good to see you all. It's been a long time since we've all been here together. So anyways, I know Cierra would want me to start this little chat with a dad joke, but I'm not going to go that route. I do have a quote that I think about a lot when I'm writing about post-quantum cybersecurity, which is increasing by the day, it seems. And the quote is, "More than any other time in history, mankind faces a crossroads. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness, the other to total extinction. Let us pray we have the wisdom to choose correctly." And that's by Woody Allen. But I think he really gets, this quote always reminds me of the situation that we have. The companies are desperately trying to create these powerful, robust quantum computers to tackle some of the real world challenges and to commercialize. And, they have a relatively short runway to do this. I think most people are thinking around 2030. On the other hand, there's all sorts of disruptive effects that quantum computers can create, like these post-quantum cybersecurity threats that we'll talk about. So I'm just interested if anyone has any opinions on that, on this really strange era that we're in, this balance that we are facing.
Yeah, look, it's really hard to cut through all the noise with this, right? I think if we go back, I don't know, when we first started this, Matt, I don't think PQC or cybersecurity felt like very, very far away. I don't know if you guys felt the same about this. And it just feels like as these roadmaps have got increasingly close, 2030 doesn't really feel that far away now. For what it's worth, it feels like it's increasing in pressure. I don't know what you guys think.
So I'd also say, when I joined the Quantum Insiders back in 2024, and I remember there would be days where Matt and I wouldn't necessarily have a lot to write about. And that has changed so fundamentally over the past almost 2 years now. There is so much to write about. In fact, there is too much to possibly cover. So I also remember when I started, the timelines were, of course, always 5 to 10 years away, as they always are. But the dates that I was hearing were very prevalently 2035 and up, 2040. Some were even saying 2050. And now I think I quite consistently hear and see in the roadmaps, we're looking at 2030, and I believe even 2029 has been a more recent number that's been thrown around. And so when I think about the fact it feels like 2026 just started and we're already thinking about 2027, I think that is utterly terrifying in terms of the migration to post-quantum cryptography, and we get into that conversation. So yeah, I do feel that there's pressure. I do feel that things have accelerated quite meaningfully, for sure.
I feel that we need to throw someone under the bus to explain the kind of concepts of what we're talking about here. And I feel the person who turned up to the call with Shaw's algorithm behind him is probably the right person to do that. So I don't know, Chris, explain to us what on earth we're talking about here. What's the context?
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. So QDay, right? This is supposed to be the day we have I think it's called a QRQC. So, CRQC, cryptographically relevant quantum computer. So this is probably going to be a fault-tolerant system. So going back to what Cierra was talking about, some of those timelines, roadmaps we're seeing towards 2030 will have significantly large number of logical qubits. So that's a nice term that we've seen pop up in some of the roadmaps of the last few years. And these systems are going to be arguably sufficiently powerful to crack some of our encryption schemes that are being used quite frequently for global security right now. So this is specifically RSA encryption, elliptical encryption. So basically everything that all the algorithms or cryptographic techniques that we currently have are based on these, and they are vulnerable to a quantum attack, which is pretty scary. So QDay is supposed to be the day where that threat or risk becomes evident to the world. And basically, what happens after QDay? How do we react to this? What are the kind of vulnerabilities that get exposed? It's an active question, and I think a lot of us don't really know the full implications to this. One thing that I think about quite a lot when it comes to this is there's the obvious large disruptions, hacking, fraudulent security signatures, like getting into the banking systems. There's also the other stuff that's maybe a little bit more surgical or happening in the dark that could be just as scary. I mean, anyone that's going to be doing something like this or using a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, it's probably going to be a nation state. So what are their intentions? Is it to disrupt the global banking system? Maybe. Maybe it's something a little bit more nefarious. Maybe it comes down to, I don't know, military applications or trade secrets within intergovernmental kind of like discussions. So I think there is an element of secrecy that also plays into this. Will we know exactly when QDay has happened? Like, how stealthy are these players going to be? And then there's the obvious massive disruption kind of discussion. So there's a lot happening to this.
I want to hear everyone's opinion on this, because just over the years, to me, the way it's portrayed a lot is QDay is going to happen, and then there's just going to be, Steven Spielberg level post-apocalyptic disruption. And I want to hear, because I have some ideas on this too, but I kind of want to hear what you all think of what happens when QDay or Q week or Q month happens. Like, what are some of the things that could possibly happen?
I think one, I want to say I really love this description of Steven Spielberg, because every time I hear the term QDay, I think of it as one of those zombie apocalyptic movies where you see there's like a news site in the background that's announcing that there's this zombie outbreak, and then it usually cuts to like scenes of New York City and people are running around and it's very chaotic and everything's failing. And so I always kind of have this image in my head when I think of QDay, and I actually quite dislike the term for that reason, because I feel like it's very detracting from what's actually happening. And I think it's very difficult to say, but what I think would happen is, one, we have to consider that QDay is not this necessarily future day, but that we have, of course, the risk of harvest now, decrypt later. So we have nefarious actors that are potentially gathering and harvesting data that could be unlocked later, and this could be things that are very maybe things that aren't that significant, but the risk is, of course, the pieces of data that are parts of critical infrastructure. So if it's medical data, is it data that governments are trying to protect? Is it financial data? And so now they have this information, and we're assuming that there is a day at which there is a cryptographically relevant quantum computer that goes online, and we're assuming that these two parties are one and two the same, and that's very not necessarily likely. And so I try to imagine what would happen if we have this fault-tolerant quantum machine. How does that actually play into the public being alerted that we now have this ability? And so if we look at claims of quantum advantage that have happened throughout media, there's usually some sort of paper that's published or announcement made by a company, and then everyone in the quantum industry treats it like it could potentially be contagious, because we don't want to be the one that actually portrays hype or pushes a narrative that is inaccurate. And so we kind of approach it, within the industry anyways, we approach it very skeptically and cautiously. And it takes several different groups of people to go through it before we establish whether or not it's something that's actually significant. And so my assumption is that we would treat this much the same. and that it would start with a scientist who might be aware of something that has happened, and maybe he shares it with someone else, and maybe she shares it with a company, and maybe the company is aligned with a government, where it's very difficult to say. And then this slowly gets into media, and then it might take some time before people actually believe that it's a thing that has happened. And this reminds me a lot of the pandemic and how the pandemic unfolded. It wasn't, oh, there's this contagion and there's mass chaos and New York is on fire and all of these things. It was very much like pockets of people becoming ill, and we're slowly seeing how this actually affects the economy. And I imagine it will happen very gradual like that. And I don't see this as being a thing where there's like, energy grids blacking out. And I think it's something where we adjust to this new reality where systems that were built on layers of trust, we no longer have that trust. And we're now trying to evaluate in how we treat our data and who we trust our data with. And this will, of course, have fallout. But I think it's much more complex than saying it will be one day and all of a sudden there's mass catastrophe.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I'm trying to remember what I was doing in 1999, December 31st, right? I'm pretty sure I logged onto my computer and I was a nerd. I was like, oh, goodbye. I will. Good luck. I'll see you tomorrow. And it was like completely underwhelming and nothing, but that was like a very technical thing. And, bar some edge cases, it wasn't that big a deal. But to your point, Cierra, I'm very interested to see what happens, maybe terrified to see what happens when we have that first example. And I guess there's a couple of examples, right? One is your pandemic piece, which is everyone plays catch up. And the other one is what's going on with Anthropic and Mythos at the moment, which is, ostensibly it is working with the company saying, hey, look, we built a thing, you should probably be aware of it. Let's create a new council and make sure that we're appropriately handling how we deal with cybersecurity risks. I'm really curious what you guys think around, that practical question of how this then rolls out. Like, what are the next steps? I think you articulated it great. I'm wondering what others think around that.
One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is more like analyzing this like through game theory, and I think it just the pure sociological effect is going to be more than the technological effect. And one of the things I think Cierra brought up is this idea of the hype. And I've always been accused of being a bit of a cheerleader and a hyper, I guess. But, I've always tried to tamp that down a bit and always try to add limitations and try to give some idea of, the technological hurdles that are, still out there, quite frankly. But what I think is by tamping that down so much, probably a good idea, that right now I see rather than QDay is going to be this mass effect, I think there's going to be certain areas. So for example, nation states, big companies, medium to large companies, I think are going to be fine. I think they have, and we talk about crypto, I think the bigger Bitcoin, Ethereum are all going to be well on their way to becoming, post-quantum secure. However, I don't know whether you've ever had the experience of telling your friends that, you work with quantum computing or that you are a quantum computer reporting about it, and they look at you like you're growing antlers. What I really worry about is that segment, the small to medium, that really probably haven't even heard about it, and usually only hear about it when this kind of hype hits this level of, Spielbergian proportions that scares everyone. And then when you're scared, as we find out in the pandemic and climate change and all that, you don't necessarily make the best decisions. It can lead to denialism. It can lead to aggression. It can lead to a lot of horrible things. So there's got to be a bridge that we're going to cross to try to deliver this message to people that might not know about quantum computing, that we can kind of make them understand the positives and the negatives about it, but also make them aware that in my opinion, I think they're going to be the most vulnerable. I think there are things in place right now, probably left over from the Cold War, that would say, if China attacks the US with a massive quantum attack, the US is going to attack China. And that's not going to be good for anybody. Or, a hacker that is going to hack in and try to bring down the financial system. Like, what value would that be? Because now you not only created a apocalyptic kind of scenario, you're already in it. So I think there's things that cover that. But when I think about the small to medium sized businesses, I think they're the ones that are going to be taken off guard with this. And I'm still convinced, that as aware as I think sometimes we're in a bubble or a silo, we know about it and we feel like everyone knows about it. But I think there's going to be vast swaths of business and industry that are going to be taken, unaware.
See, I'm not sure if I'm as worried about the small and medium-sized businesses. I guess I'd go a bit further in that, most companies today, like ourselves, right? We rely on SaaS software, right? We use Apple iPhones, and I think Cloudflare and Apple, Google, etc. We build a lot on Google, right? Have kind of got their heads around this. I'd be curious for pushback on this. I mean, this is the assumption I'm operating on, perhaps naively. Where I'm a bit more worried is I think it would be pretty shocking if we haven't already, in Canada or the US, secured nuclear facilities with appropriate levels of encryption. One would like to think that that is already in play or already has been sorted. What I perhaps worry about is the stuff which isn't nuclear, isn't weaponry, stuff that we will obviously be taking a close look at, but can have systemic risk for populations, and isn't running on Google or Cloudflare or everyone else, or Apple who's securing this. I'm talking stuff, like you said, that was built in the 60s and 70s, right? An insurance pricing business, a water storage and cleaning, municipal organization. That's kind of what worries me. I'm curious if I'm being naive on the small business point, though.
No, I think I agree with you, Alex. And there's a couple of reasons for this, right? And this goes back to what Cierra was also mentioning with, some of these state actors and a fault tolerant system coming online. There's not going to be too many of these fault tolerant, cryptographically relevant systems in the beginning, right? So that means your compute capacity is quite limited. So that means the entire internet is not going to be decrypted overnight. It's going to be strategic. It's going to be surgical. These are going to be very crown jewel kind of applications that you have to go through. So prioritize the most sensitive or the most secretive thing that you need, probably by a nation state, right? I don't think that this would come from a private sector player. So that does kind of limit the range of attack, I think, in some sense. So I think it would be a lot more strategic. So just to go back on the nuclear threat, I know that there nuclear keys and things like that, they actually have like analog systems in place so that, you limit the amount of cryptography that you require for that. So that I'm not too worried about, but it is these other kind of like government utility infrastructure, right? Large corporations and organizations are intrinsically really bad at adopting secure communications. This is because of like how big they are, right? So many different departments and communication channels. So it becomes difficult to do that. And apparently financial services are also quite slow at adopting new kind of technologies. So a lot of legacy kind of softwares that are already in place. So I definitely think it's like a large organization and very much crown jewel kind of applications that are most at risk in this kind of scenario. That's who I would target first, right? If I was a nefarious player doing something, yeah.
Maybe you are, Chris. We don't know that. I'm curious how this plays out, though, right? So it kind of builds on what Cierra was saying, what Matt was saying around the zombies stampeding around New York. I think we know today, or we have an assumption today, that the leading quantum devices are in America, Canada, Europe, for example. We've seen recent news, right, Matt, around new releases in China. But at the moment, and you guys should jump in and correct me, it feels like, at least on quantum compute, these regions are ahead. So if you take that, which, I don't know if you want to push back on that, and then you say, okay, well, where's that going to happen? Is it going to happen within a government facility, or is it going to be happening within a private or publicly listed company? Like, I'm very curious how that plays out. It's, Jane Doe sitting within company X realizes, okay, next week we are going to be able to use a cryptographically relevant quantum computer. Like, how does that play out? Are the agencies jumping in, like FBI and CIA, or is it something where they're already discussing very closely with the federal agencies? What do you think?
I think that's a really good question. I also think that there's two pieces here. So one, it goes back to are we assuming that the people who have the most use, like are we assuming that government has direct access to these QPUs that will be cryptographically relevant? I mean, that is one question. I think that there are certain companies that are very aligned with government initiatives. And so if they have devices that go online, I expect the government to be very involved. And I think that there are plenty of other companies that are not necessarily aligned with one national strategy, and they have globalized. And so who do they alert? I've also thought about this. What is the process for alerting the local government agency that you may or may not have the ability to break cryptography? I think that's a really interesting question. And the other thing I also want to say is we assume that the quantum computing capability is in America, Europe, China, what have you. But if I were a company or even a nation that recognized the ability of quantum computers to have such detrimental effects, I would not be too vocal about my quantum computing capability. So I also kind of operate under the assumption that the computer that goes online, I think it will be very surprising to us who it is, because I would want to keep that under wraps. I wouldn't want a lot of people looking at me for that type of development.
It's kind of weird, isn't it? Because it's like you can almost 4 or 5 years is far enough that you can have the threat, but you don't have to be that specific around it. Like you can, whoever it is who's mentioning 2028, 2029, 2030, whatever it is, it's just far enough that it can be fine just to say, oh, look, this is the timeline. It's going to be a bit weird when we get to 2029. Are these estimates going to update? I'm curious how you think it plays out. Like, Matt, you see it with a flurry of releases from all the different companies. How do you think it's going to play out? Do you think you're even going to see it?
I definitely think we're going to see it. And what I see, and again, my hyper background, I've been following quantum computer. I was thinking about our discussion, and I realize now that I was thinking about quantum computing before I even had a computer. Okay. Like, I remember reading about it in New Science magazine, and it was so futuristic and sci-fi. The joke was, it's always, back then, quantum computers were always 10 years away and then 5 years away. But what I've seen lately is not just that the progress is increasing since I started really covering it, 2019. But what I see is the pace is increasing. And I think it's inevitable that within, I don't know about timelines, but I think it's gonna happen. But for all the reasons you all have so well articulated, the effects are going to be, almost like a bell curve of what could possibly happen, from the apocalyptic to maybe next to nothing. And that's kind of my intuition about it, my kind of intuitive feel about what's been happening.
Yeah, super interesting. Two things that I think about, as this kind of unfolds, and this touches on what all of you have been speaking about. If we take a look, I think we actually have a couple of examples with massively disruptive technologies that could potentially be even used for military applications. When we start taking a look at AI, recently in the States, I think it was the Department of War wanted to leverage AI tools for some of their strategy and deployment and things like that. And I think that there was, I can't remember which companies involved. I think it was Anthropic that actually refused to remove some of the guide rails or barriers that blocked their models from being used in the certain application, right? So what's really interesting to me, we have a good understanding of what types of algorithms or gates we need for these kind of circuits to break the different encryption schemes. How easy is it to build in safeguards and rails in our compilation stack? So that's, the onus on the actual private sector to develop technologies that actually prohibit our fault-tolerant quantum systems from being used in the specific application. But also understanding that breaking cryptography is actually interesting for a range of reasons. Maybe you're not a nefarious player, but it is useful sometimes. For example, I've also heard the argument being made for using a quantum computer so that we can access some of the lost keys of Bitcoin. There's a lot of money that's sitting there that's basically unusable, untouchable right now because it's locked behind security protocols, and people have lost their keys and can't access it. So, there's value that can come from this as well. So I'm really interested to understand from the quantum computing side. We know that post-quantum cryptography is being rolled out. There's a lot of companies developing this to protect us, but then also from the people building the technology. What kind of guide rails will you start implementing in your technology stack as you roll this out? Will you be creating a quantum system that can be used for code breaking, or do you kind of like prevent your technology from leaning into this application? I think that's an interesting question to pose to the industry. We'll see where it lands with them.
I think that's a great question that I have not yet heard. And if I think about the discussions we have around post-quantum cryptography or any sort of even QKD, any ways to protect ourselves, I feel that those of us who have these conversations and see it as important, we typically put the responsibility on the vendors and the end users that need to become protected against quantum computers. But it's interesting because this fully reframes the responsibility on those who are developing the technology to begin with, which makes sense. So then it's not so much us pushing PQC, which we should, to be fair, but more so pushing those who are creating QPUs to build in guardrails so that we don't have to worry so much about convincing end users who aren't necessarily always super interested in quantum technology, nor do they believe that it will happen within a certain timeline. So maybe that's more of the way in which we should be having these discussions. And I also think that ourselves as the communicators and the media also have the responsibility to ensure we're talking about it in such a way that is very accurate and not hypey. But really love that question, Chris.
If it's interesting for you guys, I mean, we ran an event in, I think it was 2022, and we were shocked because we had the federal agencies call up to attend. And I think one of the reasons that they wanted to be around this and watching was to kind of keep monitoring the level of engagement around these issues. The second point that you may or may not be aware of is there has been documented, I've been told personally that we've had federal agencies going with very short notice going to visit the vendors. Obviously, we can't share the details around that, but maybe just to give you a flavor, it is not like we have some generic guidance given out by NIST. This is something that's been actively worked on. Other federal agencies are actively visiting vendors, and equivalents like this are happening all over the world, both from an attack vector standpoint and a defensive standpoint. So I'm curious to see if you guys have come across any of those kind of examples as you've been talking around the industry, but I thought it would be interesting to share that.
That is interesting. I have a question, and I'm coming at it completely, don't know, maybe this is more for Chris, but I'm wondering about the capacity of, so when we think of hacking now, we think of usually a lone person with a black hoodie on, with a single access to a PC or Mac, causing all kinds of havoc. Is there any way someone could use, quantum computing as a service to create any sort of hacking scenarios, or would that be out of the realm? And second of all, do you all think that the black hoodie will still be the uniform of the quantum hacker as we move into the quantum era? Chris, either one of those questions.
Well, I mean, that's why I was bringing up the question around safe guide rails, right? If we don't develop anything like this, then definitely I think anybody that has access to a cloud-based fault tolerance system could potentially do something like this. Luckily, if we are leveraging cloud-based systems, I think that there's a lot of ways for us to build in those techniques to kind of like mitigate the risk. So that's the best case scenario, right? Going back to who's going to be the main actor here, I definitely think it's more to nation states. I think that's the serious threat that we have here, because this is going to be a secret system. Like Cierra said, if you are going to be doing something dodgy with your quantum computer, you don't want people to know about it. You don't want to break the internet overnight. You're going to be systematically prioritizing what you're looking for and go after that and keep it as secret as long as possible, right? Because then you're going to be most successful. So yeah, I think it's going to be nation states, because it's quite large resources we're talking about here. And anything from the private sector, I imagine we are going to start building in techniques to mitigate risks for people accessing it and doing dodgy things like that. Although I could be wrong, because I mean, people are still using cloud-based resources to do who knows what, right? So it's tricky.
Interesting. Well, I think we could talk a lot about this, probably for hours, about this subject, but I just kind of want to wrap up and see if any of you have any final thoughts on this.
I do think it's still the black hoodie, for the record.
Thank God you said that, Cierra. I feel much better now. Well, it's been a great chat. I really appreciate your insight and inputs. Nice to hear some of these other ideas I really don't get access to. So I appreciate this too.
Yeah, great to see you all.